On a Wednesday morning in the first week of March 2009, Sylvia Bowen stood at the edge of her gravel driveway outside Bowen's Mill and Grain in Pratt County, Kansas, and watched the county extension agent's white truck disappear around the bend in the road without so much as a wave goodbye. He had been there for 40 minutes. He had walked her floor, asked her 8 questions, and then told her in the patient voice of a man who believes he is delivering kindness that the market had changed and that operations like hers were not positioned to survive the next 5 years. He hadn't said it cruelly that almost made it worse. That was the spring of 2009. And if you know anything about what was happening to small-scale grain mills in the southern plains at that time, you already know the weight of what Sylvia was carrying. The commodity consolidation had been building for a decade. The big elevator cooperatives out of Wichita and Dodge City had absorbed contract after contract. The smaller operations, the ones that had been milling specialty grains and running custom grind orders for local feedlots and bakeries, were being squeezed from both ends. Input costs up, margins down. The customers who used to drive 40 miles to get a specific grind on a specific wheat variety were either buying generic from the co-op now or had folded themselves and weren't buying anything from anybody. Sylvia Bowen was 53 years old that March, and she had been in the grain business in one form or another for her entire adult life. She had grown up watching her father run the original mill that her grandfather had built in 1947 on a creek bottom south of Cullison. She had learned to read moisture content by feel before she could drive. She had rebuilt her first roller mill at 27 with money she'd borrowed from her mother-in-law and stubbornness she'd borrowed from no one. When her husband Ray had died in 2003, she had kept the operation running through 2 bad harvests and 1 broken leg without missing a single contracted delivery because the people who depended on her ground knew that Sylvia Bowen showed up, whether it was convenient or not. She ran custom milling mostly, wheat for specialty bakers, corn for 2 regional distilleries that had been coming to her for years because her grind consistency was something they said they couldn't replicate anywhere else at any price. Feed grain blends for a handful of ranchers who ran stocker operations and had specific formulation needs that the big co-ops couldn't be bothered to accommodate. She also kept a line of stone-ground flours that went to a regional natural foods distributor out of Wichita. Small volumes but steady. The kind of steady that pays the power bill in a slow month. In March of 2009, she had 4 employees. A mill operator named George, who had worked for her father before her. A loader and delivery man named Sam. A woman named Kay, who ran the front office and had been doing so for 9 years. And a part-time mechanic named Al Pruitt, who came 3 days a week and kept everything running. She was trying to figure out how to keep all 4 of them through the summer when the small volume spring orders started to thin. Let me tell you what March meant to a small grain mill on the southern plains, because it matters for understanding what Sylvia was up against. By the first week of March, winter wheat was still in the ground, but the year's contracts were already being decided. Bakers and distillers and feedlot operators were making their sourcing decisions for the coming season. Phone calls were being made, agreements were being signed. For a custom mill like Bowen's, March was the month that determined whether the next 12 months would be survivable or not. A good March meant the phones rang and the contracts came in and you could plan the year with some confidence. A bad March meant you spent the summer hoping something broke your way. Sylvia had a bad March. The distillery in Great Bend had called in February to say they were consolidating their grain sourcing through a single supplier, and that supplier was not Bowen's. They had been her largest single customer. The natural foods distributor had called 2 weeks later. Their new regional warehouse manager had renegotiated all their supplier contracts with an eye towards standardization, and standardization meant larger operations with certified organic documentation that Sylvia didn't have and couldn't afford to get. She had lost 30% of her annual revenue in the space of 3 weeks, on phone calls that each lasted less than 10 minutes. She had made her own calls. She had driven to Hutchinson to meet with a regional bakery cooperative that she'd been trying to get into for 2 years. They had been polite, and interested and ultimately non-committal, which is a kind of answer. She had called a feedlot operator north of Pratt, who she'd heard was unhappy with his current supplier. He had listened carefully and said he'd think about it. She understood what that meant. She had dropped her custom milling rate twice in 6 months, and the phone had still not rung the way it needed to ring. The extension agent's visit that Wednesday morning had been her own idea. She had thought or hoped that someone from the county agricultural office might have connections or programs or something she hadn't thought of. What she got instead was the recommendation that she consider transitioning to a storage-only operation and leasing her milling equipment to someone better positioned to use it. She stood in the driveway after his truck disappeared and did the math that she had been avoiding for 3 weeks. The math said she had perhaps 4 months before she would have to make the kind of decisions she had promised herself she would never have to make. That was when the phone rang, and it was not the kind of call she was expecting. Let me tell you about the call, because this is where the story begins to turn, though at the time it didn't feel like turning. It felt like a complication arriving on top of a crisis. The caller was a woman named Audra Dellinger, who ran a small artisan bread operation out of a town called Medicine Lodge, about 50 miles southwest. Sylvia knew the name, but had never dealt with her directly. Audra made sourdough and heritage grain loaves that she sold at farmers markets and through a handful of specialty food shops in the region. She was not a large account by any commercial measure. She wanted to know if Sylvia could mill turkey red wheat, a heritage variety, to a specific extraction rate that her current supplier had recently told her was not something they could accommodate reliably at her volume. Sylvia said yes, because she could, because she had milled turkey red before and knew the grain and knew what it needed and knew how to get the extraction right. Audra Dellinger brought 40 bushels the following Friday in the bed of a pickup truck and stood in the mill watching George run it through like she was watching something she hadn't seen before. She paid on the spot and asked if Sylvia could handle regular monthly orders. Sylvia said yes. It was not enough to replace what she had lost, not even close. But it was something, and something was better than the nothing that the math had been pointing toward. Then Audra told her baker friends, "Let me tell you about what happened over the following 6 weeks," because Sylvia didn't fully understand what was happening until Kay sat her down one afternoon in late April with a yellow legal pad and showed her the numbers laid out in a way that made the pattern visible. The calls had started slowly. A woman in Wichita who made injera for a small East African restaurant and needed teff mailed to a texture her commercial supplier couldn't hit. A retired farmer near Kingman who had planted a small acreage of Bloody Butcher corn, an heirloom variety, and needed it milled for a local restaurant that was paying good money for provenance, traceable cornmeal. A young couple outside of Greensburg who had planted emmer wheat, an ancient grain, and had been told by 3 different mills that their volume was too small to be worth the setup time. None of these were large accounts. The teff woman wanted 50 pounds a month. The Bloody Butcher farmer had maybe 30 bushels. The Emmer couple had even less, but they were coming to Sylvia because Sylvia would do it, because Sylvia had the knowledge and the equipment and the patience to handle grains that didn't fit the standard template, and because the people they had talked to before Sylvia had turned them away. What was happening, Kay explained on the legal pad that April afternoon, was that the consolidation that had cost Sylvia her large accounts had simultaneously created a gap that nobody with a standardized, high-volume operation could fill. The big mills and the co-op elevators had gotten efficient by getting specialized in one direction. They could handle enormous volumes of commodity grades with speed and consistency. What they could not handle, or would not bother to handle, was the work that required flexibility, the short runs, the unusual varieties, the specific extractions and blend formulations that a dozen different small producers and specialty buyers needed in quantities that were invisible to an operation thinking in truckloads. Sylvia had been built for exactly that work, not by intention, exactly, but by the accumulation of 30 years of saying yes to things that other mills said were too small or too complicated or not worth the setup. And something else was happening that Sylvia understood only gradually and then all at once. Let me tell you about what was in the back of her mill, because this is the part of the story that most people who visited Bowen's walked past without stopping. Behind the modern roller mills and the pneumatic conveying system and the computerized moisture analyzers sat a pair of French burr millstones that Sylvia's grandfather had installed in 1951. They had been decommissioned in 1978 when her father had put in the first roller system, because rollers were faster and more consistent for commodity grain, and that was what the business had been at the time. The stones had sat in the back corner for 30 years, cleaned and covered, and occasionally inspected by Sylvia the way you check on something you can't bring yourself to get rid of. She had kept them running, not for any commercial reason that she could have defended to a bank officer or a business consultant. She had kept them running because her grandfather had installed them and they were extraordinary pieces of equipment, and because stone-ground flour produced a character in the finished product that roller-milled flour could not replicate. Something in the way the stones worked the grain slowly and incompletely, leaving more of the germ and bran distributed through the flour in a way that changed how it tasted and how it baked. She knew this, the way she knew other things about grain, from handling it, from baking with it herself on Sunday mornings, from the specific smell of stone-ground wheat flour that was different from roller mill flour in a way she could not fully articulate but could not mistake. Most of the people who came into the mill either didn't notice the stones or nodded at them the way you nod at a piece of old farm equipment that someone has kept for sentimental reasons. A few people asked about them, and Sylvia would explain, and they would listen politely and move on. But one morning in the second week of April, a man named Warren Ohlendorf came in from over near Haviland with a problem that none of the modern equipment in Sylvia's mill could solve in the way he needed it solved. Let me tell you about Warren Ohlendorf, because you need to understand the man to understand what happened next. Warren was 67 years old and had farmed wheat ground in Kiowa County for more than 40 years. He was not a man who used words carelessly or made decisions without thinking them through to the end. He had planted, that previous fall, 40 acres of red fife wheat. Red fife was a heritage Canadian variety that had nearly disappeared from commercial agriculture by the late 20th century and had been revived by a small network of specialty bakers and seed preservers who believed it had qualities worth saving. It was a harder grain to grow and a harder grain to mill than modern high-yield varieties. It needed specific handling at every step. Warren had grown it because a chef in Wichita had contacted him through a local farm-to-table network and offered to pay nearly twice the commodity wheat price for a traceable, identity-preserved supply of red fife. The chef wanted to mill it himself, in small batches, and he wanted it milled in a way that preserved the germ oil and gave his bread a depth of flavor that his customers were paying for specifically. Warren had called 4 mills. 3 had told him they couldn't run red fife through their modern rollers without cross-contamination risk to their commodity lines, which was a real concern and a reasonable one. The 4th had said they could do it, but their minimum run was 5 tons, and Warren had 40 acres, which did not produce 5 tons. He had come to Sylvia as a last resort, which is the way most of the best customers arrive. Sylvia listened to what he needed. She asked him 4 questions about the grain condition and the moisture content and the extraction rate the chef had specified. Then she walked him to the back of the mill and stood him in front of the French burr stones. Warren Ohlendorf looked at the stones for a long moment. He had grown up around stone mills. His grandfather had used one. He knew what he was looking at in a way that a younger man might not have. He turned to Sylvia and said, "Do those still run?" Sylvia said, "Every week." Warren said, "Can they hit the extraction rate he's asking for?" Sylvia said, "Come back Thursday and I'll show you." She ran a test batch on Wednesday, 20 pounds of red fife that Warren had brought as a sample, through the French burr stones at a gap she had calibrated by hand the way her grandfather had taught her to calibrate it, by feel and sound, not by instrument. The flour that came off the stones had a color and a texture and a smell that roller-milled flour simply did not have. She bagged a sample and drove it to Wichita herself on Wednesday evening, and left it with the chef's sous-chef with a note that said the extraction rate was within 2 points of spec and adjustable. The chef called Thursday morning before Warren had arrived. "Let me tell you about the next 3 months, because they are the reason Bowen's mill and grain is still running, and the reason Sylvia's daughter drives 45 minutes each way to work there now, and the reason there is a framed photograph in the front office that every new customer eventually asks about." The chef in Wichita placed a standing monthly order that was larger than anything Sylvia had expected. He told 2 other chefs. One of them was in Kansas City. One of them was in Denver. Both of them called within the week. The Kansas City chef wanted red fife and also Sonora wheat, another heritage variety, stone ground, identity preserved, traceable to the specific farm. The Denver chef wanted bloody butcher cornmeal and heritage rye that he had been unable to source from anyone who could meet his texture specification. Sylvia called Warren Ohlendorf. She told him she had more demand than his 40 acres could supply. She asked if he knew other farmers in the county who might be interested in growing heritage grain varieties under a purchase agreement. Warren said he knew 3. By the end of that summer, Sylvia had sourcing agreements with 5 farms in Kiowa and Pratt counties covering 4 heritage grain varieties. She had 8 standing accounts with specialty food buyers, most of them restaurants and artisan bakers, ranging from Wichita to Denver. She had brought Kay on full-time at a better rate and hired a second part-time mill hand. George had gone from looking for work elsewhere to training the new hire in the specific protocols that stone milling demanded. The French burr stones ran 6 days a week. But here is the part of the story that Sylvia still talks about when she tells it, and she tells it rarely, only to people she thinks will understand it, and it is the part that explains why she kept those stones running for 30 years, when no one was asking her to. In June of that year, a man named Philip Mast came to see her. Philip was the regional procurement director for a natural foods retail chain that had recently expanded into the Southern Plains market. He had heard about Bowen's from the Wichita chef. He had driven down from his regional office specifically to look at the operation. He walked the floor the way the extension agent had walked it 3 months earlier, but with different eyes. He stopped at the French burr stones for a long time. Then he said, "How long have you had these?" Sylvia told him the full version. Her grandfather, 1951, decommissioned in 1978, running weekly ever since. Philip Mast was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been trying to source stone-ground heritage grain flour for our private label program for 18 months. Every large-scale mill I've talked to has told me it can't be done profitably at the quality level our buyers expect. They keep offering the rotor-milled product with stone ground on the label and hoping I don't know the difference." Sylvia said, "Do you know the difference?" He said, "I do now." He placed a trial order before he left the building. The trial order became a quarterly contract. The quarterly contract became an anchor account that stabilized the entire operation in a way that the distillery and the natural foods distributor had once done, but differently, because this account came with something the old accounts hadn't carried. It came with a story. Philip Mast's company wanted to tell the story of Bowen's Mill on their packaging, the grandfather's stones, the heritage varieties, the farms in Kiowa and Pratt counties that were growing grain specifically for this purpose. They wanted to print Sylvia's name and a photograph of the stones on the label. She had opinions about that, and she expressed them plainly. She told Philip Mast that she would allow the story on the label if every detail was accurate, if no variety was called stone ground unless it had actually gone through the French burr stones, and if the farmers who grew the grain were named by name. He agreed to all of it. The label went on shelves the following spring. Let me tell you what Sylvia told her daughter Claire, because Claire is the one who runs the mill's operations now, and Claire is the one who keeps the photograph in the front office. Claire Bowen had been 24 in 2009, living in Wichita and working for a marketing firm, the kind of work that paid adequately and meant nothing in particular. She had watched that year from a distance, calling her mother on Sunday evenings and hearing the voice change from something careful and controlled to something that had found its footing again. She had come home for a week in September and walked the mill floor and stood in front of the French burr stones for a long time. She had asked her mother one question. She said, Why did you keep them running all those years when nobody needed them?" Sylvia had thought about it for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was deciding how to say it. Then she said, "Because I believed the need was still out there somewhere. The people who used to need what these stones produce didn't stop needing it. They just stopped being able to find it, and I thought that if I kept the capacity alive, eventually someone would come looking." Claire had moved back to Pratt County within the year, not because her mother asked her to, but because she had understood something on that September visit that she hadn't expected to understand. The mill was not a relic. It was a position. Her mother had held a position for 30 years that everyone else in the industry had abandoned because it was inconvenient, and when the market rotated and the demand re-emerged, Sylvia was the only one still standing in the right place to meet it. That kind of patience, Claire understood, was not stubbornness. It was a form of knowledge. You had to know what you were holding on to and why, or the holding on was just sentiment. Sylvia had known. She had known what the stones could do that the rollers couldn't, had known that the difference mattered even when no one was paying for it, had held the position because the position was correct, regardless of whether the market was confirming it in any given year. That is a harder thing to learn than any business school teaches. Claire runs the daily operations now. She has added 2 product lines and a direct-to-consumer mail order that Sylvia never thought to build, because Claire grew up in a world where that was possible and Sylvia hadn't. The mill has 4 full-time employees now and 3 part-time, which is more than it has ever had. They source from 11 farms. They have standing accounts in 4 states. The French burr stones still run 6 days a week. Sylvia still comes in every morning. Not to run things, she is queer about that. Claire runs things. But because the mill is the mill, and she is not a person who stops showing up, she walks the floor. She checks the grain. She runs her hand over the stone surface every morning, the way you run your hand over something you have kept faith with for a long time, not to confirm it is still there, but because the gesture itself means something. 2 years ago, a young woman from Greensburg came in with a question about milling einkorn, the most ancient of the cultivated wheat varieties, for a project she was starting. She had called 3 other mills first. She had been told by each of them that einkorn was too low-yielding and too fussy for commercial milling at any scale that made sense. She had found Bowen's through a reference from one of the heritage grain networks that had grown up around operations like Sylvia's over the past decade. Sylvia listened to her describe what she was trying to do. She asked 6 questions. Then she walked the young woman to the back of the mill and stood her in front of the French burr stones. The young woman looked at them the way Warren Ohlendorf had looked at them 15 years earlier, with the specific recognition of someone who knows what they are seeing and understands that they are not seeing it everywhere anymore. She said, "My grandmother talked about stone-milled flour. She said there was nothing else like it." Sylvia said, "There isn't." They ran a test batch that afternoon. The einkorn came off the stones with a color that was close to amber, fine textured and fragrant in a way that the young woman said she had never encountered before in any commercial product she had worked with. She asked what Sylvia would need to take her on as a regular account. Sylvia told her the minimum volume and the lead time and the pricing, which was higher than commodity milling and lower than what the young woman had been quoted by a specialty mill in Colorado that couldn't actually deliver what she needed. The young woman said she would call the following week to confirm. She called the next morning. Sylvia told Claire about it over coffee before the mill opened. Claire listened and then said, "How many times has that exact thing happened now?" Sylvia thought about it. She said, "Enough times that I've stopped being surprised by it, but not so many times that I've stopped being grateful for it." The photograph in the front office was taken by Kay on a morning in late October 2009, about 7 months after the extension agent had driven away down the gravel road. It shows Sylvia standing beside the French burr stones, not posed, not looking at the camera. She is looking at the stones the way you look at something that has come through for you, in a way you had believed it would but couldn't prove it would until it did. Behind her, through the open mill door, you can see the lot where the delivery trucks have started to come again. more of them than the photograph can fully hold. People who come into Bowen's mill and grain ask about that photograph sometimes. Claire tells them the story. She tells it the way Sylvia told it to her, not as a story about old equipment outperforming new equipment, because that is not really what it is. She tells it as a story about knowing what you have, about understanding the specific value of what you are holding before the world is ready to confirm that value to you, about the distance between being right and being recognized, and the kind of faith it takes to keep working in that gap. The French burr stones are still in the back of the mill. Sylvia keeps them calibrated the way her grandfather kept them calibrated and the way his own teacher had calibrated the stones before that. Not because the market demands it every day, but because some capacities are worth preserving not for what they are needed for today, but for what they will be needed for on the morning when everything modern has run out of answers, and someone finally comes through the door asking for the one thing that was there all along, waiting and ready. I think about Sylvia Bowen standing in that gravel driveway watching the extension agent's truck disappear, and I think about how close she came to believing what he told her, that her time had passed, that the market had spoken, and the verdict was final. She didn't believe it, not fully, but she felt the weight of it. Anyone would. What strikes me is the chain of cause and effect that runs through her story, quiet and exact. She lost the distillery account. She lost the distributor. She dropped her rates twice, and the phone still didn't ring. Every reasonable response to her situation pointed in the same direction: scale down, adapt, or close. And then Audra Dellinger called about turkey red wheat, and then Warren Ohlendorf came in from Haviland with a problem that modern equipment couldn't solve, and the whole direction changed. Not because of luck exactly, because Sylvia had kept the French burr stones running for 30 years when no one was paying her to. That is the cause. Everything else is the effect. I've been thinking about what kind of person does that. Keeps something alive for 3 decades on the belief that it still has value, even when the market isn't confirming it, even when visitors walk past it without stopping. That takes something specific. It takes an honest understanding of what you actually have and what it can actually do. Not what you wish it could do, not nostalgia, but a clear-eyed knowledge that this thing is genuinely capable of producing something that nothing else produces. Sylvia had that. She knew what stone milling did to grain that roller milling couldn't replicate. She knew it from baking with the flour herself on Sunday mornings, from the smell, from the texture. That kind of knowledge is earned slowly, and it doesn't leave you. But knowledge alone doesn't keep you in that driveway for 30 years. Plenty of people know things they don't act on. What Sylvia had alongside the knowledge was the integrity to keep the commitment she had made to her grandfather's equipment and to her own understanding of what mattered, even when keeping it was inconvenient and expensive, and nobody was watching. She didn't maintain those stones because it made obvious business sense. She maintained them because abandoning them would have been a kind of dishonesty she wasn't willing to practice. That is a moral position, whether she would call it that or not. And then there is the sheer endurance of it. 30 years is a long time to hold a position that the world around you has decided is obsolete. Ray died. 2 bad harvests came. The consolidation ground through the industry. The extension agent drove away. And still Sylvia showed up every morning and kept the mill running and kept the stones calibrated and kept the faith that the need was still out there even when she couldn't see it. That is not stubbornness. Stubbornness is holding on without knowing why. What Sylvia had was persistence with a reason, the kind that weathers every discouraging thing the world sends at it because the reason at the center of it is sound. Claire understood all of this in a single September visit and rearranged her life accordingly. I find that remarkable. She saw what her mother had built, not the equipment, not the accounts, but the position, the sustained, patient, principled holding of a capacity that the rest of the industry had abandoned, and she recognized it for what it was, a form of wisdom that only looks obvious in hindsight. The stones are still running. I keep coming back to that.